Welcome to the Leeds Rhinos podcast, episode 10. It's a Thursday, which means it's our Q&A edition. But this week we've got something a bit special and different from normally what we would do on the Q&A edition. Thanks for joining us. My name's Phil Daly. I'm the head of media and PR at Leeds Rhinos. I'm delighted to be joined by our head of youth development, John Bastian, today. And today we're going to be reflecting on the life and contribution of Bob Pickles, our former chief scout who passed away sadly earlier this week. And we're going to be recollecting on his life and the impact and legacy he's left here at Leeds Rhinos. John, thanks for joining us. Sad news this week, obviously Bob passing away. What's your earliest memories of Bob?
I think probably starting out, back in 2000 at Leeds Rhinos and starting to just go to games with him. I was working on the scholarship as an assistant coach, and part of my remit at that particular time were also going out and doing talent identification with Bob. So I actually started, on that journey, with him and used his experience, used his character, his personality, and he had a great influence on people, did Bob. And that's how it started with Bob and myself.
Yeah, I remember first meeting Bob when I first came to the club in 1997 when he was working alongside Dean Bell. He had first come to the club under Dougie Lawton, and you used to hear tales of Dougie's old office, which was in the old tunnel. For those who you remember the old tunnel, Dougie's office was just off on the left there, a cloud of smoke coming out of it, and him and Bob would be in there discussing which players they were looking to bring in, because that was a real change for Leeds, wasn't it, at that time, to really focus on youth. Dougie Lawton was remembered for his time, a big spending in terms of his time at Widnes, and then when he came to Leeds, but actually it was that youth development program that those two put in place that really changed the course of the club.
It certainly did, and they played the part, in the building, of, youth development, and it became more significant, around that time. And then Dean Bell, he came along, and I think Hugh McGann and Bob worked really closely, alongside those two guys, and they were inspirational when it came to youth and building, for the future, of Leeds Rhinos. The talent ID was significant. It was so important, that we got the right, the right players, the quality players, that we could work with that had a real chance, playing in Super League. And Bob, Dean, and you, they were all, really influential, in that period of time of getting some of the best juniors, in the country, and it paid dividends, further down the track.
You mentioned there your early days when you were a scholarship coach and going out to watch games. Bob will have seen hundreds of thousands of young players over his time scouting players. What was the secret of his success? What was he telling you that he was looking for in a player?
He'd go to a game, he'd talk, he'd chat, but he always had his eye on the football match, and he'd just pop up, with 2-3 names, and he were quite intent on which players he thought, had a real chance, and he stuck with that. But he were really good, at communicating with people. He were quite an influential figure, in the community game, certainly round Leeds, and, with other, professional clubs. Everybody knew Bob was. He was from Middleton, he was steeped in the history of rugby league. He played professional rugby league, I think Keighley, and he had a real passion, for Hunslet. But his passion grew, around talent identification. Very opinionated, very passionate, about promoting juniors. And he wanted them to play. He wanted them to play for Leeds Rhinos, and that happened. And he wouldn't go away from it. If a player had a bad game or had a dip in form, he stayed with them, and that was a big part of Bob's character.
Yeah, you say he was very opinionated there in terms of he had an opinion and he was happy to share it with you. I remember I was very fortunate when I first came to the club in 1997. I had shared an office with a gentleman called Stuart Duffy, who you know Duff very well, and him and Bob were thick as thieves. And I would often end up in conversation, and I was just like a sponge. I'd just sit there and just listen to them men carry on, and they, what they didn't know about the game of rugby league wasn't worth knowing. But he had a tremendous knowledge of the game, Bob, didn't he? Not just in Leeds and the local area, but right across the country.
It did. He didn't just focus on Leeds. He'd obviously be watching rep games, Yorkshire, Lancashire. He'd be watching, the schools competition. He'd be watching, England youth, and he'd specifically start to look and target players. He liked tough players. Adrian Morley, were as tough as he get, and I know for a fact when he saw Morley, he knew, that there were a player in there that needed some little bits of work, but geez, he were competitive, he were tough, his effort areas were brilliant, and he never took his eye off him. And he did that with many, many players, did Bob.
Yeah, there's a great video that Super League did a couple of years ago, where Bob told the story of how he signed Moz, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes below. And he talked about how he went over to see him play in, I think it was a Lancashire Schools Cup final. Was so impressed that he got straight in touch with Moz's parents and got him signed. And the following week there was an England youth game, and all the scouts were there to watch. I think it's up in Cumbria somewhere. And they're all talking about how they're going to be the race to sign Morley, and Bob knew he already had the contract in his inside pocket, and the deal was done.
He didn't hesitate. Honestly, Phil, he did not hesitate in doing that. If he saw a player and he knew that player had a realistic chance and he'd be great, for our club at Leeds Rhinos, then he would make that phone call. He would find a way of connecting, as fairly as he could, with parents, without anybody else knowing, and he were on his way. And usually he'd get that player.
Yeah, and he had a great trick. You mentioned parents there, and I remember talking to him last year when sadly Rob Burrow passed away, about how the story of how he came to sign Rob, and he also tells the same story with the Adrian Morley signing, that in finals kids will always take their medals to their parents first of all. It's the first thing he does. The first thing, every child wants to show their medal to their parents. So what he used to do is he'd watch the medal presentation, and then if he wanted to see which parent was with which child, he'd just follow them with their medal. And invariably, the first two people he went to was his parents, and that's how he first met Jeff Burrow. And I was in contact with Jeff this week, and he was really sad that Bob had passed, but he was a great friend to Jeff. Was Bob, and the same story with Adrian Moore. It's a great little tip there. I mean, that's the poacher's eye, that, isn't it?
And he did. He had those little quirky ways of doing things. I think the biggest thing for me is that he didn't blink, Phil. He just used to walk up. He might introduce himself. He were always great, to chat to with Bob, and people were easy in his company as well. And he wouldn't go overboard, wouldn't oversell things at Leeds. But he said, we'd love to chat with you, we'd love to bring you down to, to Rhinos and show you around the facilities, etc. And it usually started from there, and he'd also let them know that the son were a really talented player and would love him to be part of our journey. And he did that, again, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but he did that with so many players, did Bob. And it didn't just finish start in 1997. It went on and on and on, until, I think probably around about 2014, 15, when he started to step down a little bit.
And you talked there about his personal touch, but also he didn't blink. He didn't hesitate if he saw a player with talent. Those two things, how important are they even to this day in terms of signing players? Because I know it's such a competitive marketplace in terms of the clubs trying to get the best young talent, but there's agents involved these days and things like that. How important is it to have those key skills?
I think it's really important, to understand, what getting your point across, to parents. Now you can actually, influence, the development, of their son. And Bob had that, in bundles, and even at the time, we were progressing as a club, in regards to developing the next generation of players, that we're gonna actually, be a significant part of our history. And Bob, he got the players on board, but there was certainly, some terrific staff, that played the part, in the progress of those young players. And everybody contributes, Phil, to that. But the parents, they're the biggest contributors, because they've got to give the directive, to the son to hopefully, create them opportunities. And Bob, he knew that we had a strong system, and he also knew that system were going to build and get even stronger. There were Gary Etherington, Paul Carrick, they came in and they played a big part in that as well. They knew that youth development, you know, were a big part of Leeds Rhinos, but we could be even stronger. We could be even more powerful. And that certainly happened. And Bob, you know, he'll be forever remembered, you know, for being significant in that drive towards achieving that.
And have you got a favourite Bob story down the years? That, I mean, he was a great storyteller, but he was involved in so many of them as well.
I think probably one of the best stories with Bob is that, you know, after we'd had a scholarship game or an academy game or under 21s or reserves, you always knew where food was because Bob would always find it, you know. So I just said, lads would be saying, "Where's food, John? Where's food? Where we offer a foot? Where's food? Just follow Bob. He'll get you there." And there were too many. And even going to games, you know, and watching players, you know, and chatting through to him, and I think one of the ones I always remember were probably when we went to Sheffield. And we went to watch Lancashire versus Yorkshire, and we were just both sat on bank. It was a lovely May day, and we were watching game. And then this player just he stepped, he moved, he scored. Then he swerved at speed and created a try. We were playing fullback, and we just looked at each other and went, "You can't teach that. You know, he's going to be a real talent. He was a great athlete as well." And Bob just says, "Yeah, we need to get him." And that was Callum Watkins, you know. And it were them little things like that, you know, that you knew that, you know, Bob had that talent and that eye. But he also had a talent for players that needed some development as well. You know, and I'll mention it, you know, that you know, Tom and George Burgess, you know, they were on our scholarship. It was Bob that saw them. You know, I'm sure that other scouts saw them, but Bob got them on our scholarship. Unfortunately, you know, they ended up going to Bradford at that particular time. They could, but it was Bob Pickles that identified those lads, you know, and got them on board at Leeds Rhinos. And he had a great eye, you know, for being able to see the ones that, you know, that were standout players that had a real chance, but also ones that needed some development, that physically needed a lot more growing and development, and that maybe were a little bit behind, but would certainly catch up, you know, with, you know, a professional environment that could offer them, you know, specific things, you know, that would help them build, you know, the strength and conditioning, the skills, the greater understanding of the game. And he was really good at that. And like most of us as well, he'll be the first one to say that he got a few wrong. You do. That's the game.
Yeah, I think we'll settle for on the balance of things. We'll settle for his wins over his losses.
Oh, so his wins certainly outnumbered his losses. You know, I think he could name 2 international teams, you know, that Bob played his part in. You know, getting players on board, you know, at Leeds Rhinos, and obviously, you know, broadening out, you know, further afield, you know, to the NRL, and playing representative rugby, you know, for England. He certainly had a great impact, and he left a wonderful, wonderful legacy to Bob Pickles.
Yeah, and it wasn't one size fits all. It wasn't just going to see who's the best schoolboy at that particular age. I mean, pretty much anyone could go and see a game of a lad that's that talented. But it was, you mentioned the players that could develop. I think probably someone like Ryan Hall, who'd gone to was playing open age by the time he came into our system. You know, a bit of a late developer, but Bob could see that by getting him into our system, he could do a job for us.
He did that with many players. You know, and Rob's a wonderful, wonderful example. You know, Rob Burrow. And Rob were one of the bravest players you'd ever see. You know, as a young lad. You know, developing. You know, he were playing against lads, you know, 2, 3 times sizes bigger. But Bob never moved from him. He knew that he had a talent. He knew, you know, that he could create things on a football field and do things on a football field that you weren't going to be able to teach. And he was brave. His effort areas were good, and he had a real enthusiasm, you know, for playing the game. So he would not hesitate, you know, actually seeing talent. Paul McShane was another wonderful example. Paul McShane and Paul did tell you this. He used to frustrate me sometimes. I used to go up and watch him at Hunslet Parkside, and I'd say to Bob, "Geez, he didn't do much today." Then next week he was outstanding, and learning and understanding about players. You know, Bob played a big part, you know, in that with my development, because he said they're not going to turn up every week. You know, they're not going to turn up every week and produce. That is a difficult thing for any young player. But when you see talent, you know, do your best to try and nurture it and take it to another level. And the majority, as long as they come with you, Bob said it'll work. They won't be far off. Ryan Hall were another interesting one. Again, I can always remember Paul Daly coming up and tipping me up at my desk, you know, down at Leeds Rhinos. I think it was 2005, saying that there's a lad there that I think everyone might have missed him, and he was playing open age rugby for Ulton Raiders, and he was playing under 18s. Bob and I went down to see him, and we were stood behind sticks down there at Ulton. And again, within 15 minutes, Ryan Hall had done 3 things, and we needed to sign him. Bob knew that straight away. You know, he could recognise that straight away. But again, maybe we should have seen that a little bit sooner. But he were a great add-on. And there's that many players, you know, to mention, you know, that Bob actually had an impact on. I think we'd be here for a couple of hours, if I'm honest with you, Phil.
Yeah, you mentioned him signing Rob Burrow, and that story where he first met Jeff. Last year, when we had that tribute game to Rob, and Bob was on Sky Sports talking to Jenna Brooks on that, I think he told the story then that actually that day he hadn't gone to see Rob. He'd gone to see a kid who played in the previous game. And then he was upstairs in the corner there in the bar at Featherstone having a cup of tea, and he just saw this head guard flying here, there, and everywhere on the field, and he couldn't work out what was happening, and that's what caught his attention. Then he watched Rob, and again that instinct you talked about, straight away after that game, he's gone to see Jeff and Irene and got the deal done. And he remember him saying that he was worried because it was a Fev Schools final, and obviously Rob played for Fev Lions as it is now. He presumed that his dad would be a Featherstone or maybe a Cass fan, and getting him to Leeds would be tricky. But as it turned out, Jeff was a lifelong loiner, and it was probably the easiest deal he ever had to get done.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Jeff, obviously, we used to regularly meet up, you know, with Jeff, you know, myself and Bob, and again, you know, sitting with those guys, you know, and learning lots, you know, when you're on the start, you know, of a journey. It was so interesting, you know, and again, you know, at them chats that we used to have, learnt lots from that. But they'd talk about that, you know. Actually, I didn't realise that Jeffy's a Kirkstall Road lad, you know, so he's steeped, you know, in Leeds Rhinos history, and he loves the club, you know, and it were always inevitable, you know, that if Leeds went knocking, and certainly Bob did, we were always going to get Rob Burrow, and we were very, very fortunate that happened.
And those foundations that Bob put in place, do they still have a legacy now in terms of how we do our recruitment and particularly scouting players?
Yeah, they certainly do. Yeah, you know, nothing really changes, you know, on that front. I think Bob used to watch an enormous amount of games. You know, he would watch game after game after game, and he'd then build an understanding of what were happening in the city and beyond. He'd also watch rugby union games, you know, when he got chance as well. And he'd find those players. He'd just jot names down. And that happens now. You know, it's significant that the more games that you watch, Phil, the more chance you've got of identifying more talent. And certainly Bob played his part in that, and it still happens now here at Leeds Rhinos.
And just bring it up to the modern day. In terms of what we're doing with our academy, pleased with the progress we're making?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, very good. We've got some tremendously talented players, you know, within the academy and the scholarship as well. And that's credit, you know, to the talent ID gang. You know, Simon Bell, Barry Evans do a significant job. We've got a couple of new scouts come on board with us, David Dixon, Jeff Cooper, and they're constantly out at games watching. Myself, I'll go out a fair bit, you know, and enjoy watching games as well. So we're pretty well covered in that area. But the coaches, they play such an important part in that. Mark Buttrell and his team in the scholarship, they do a wonderful job, you know, in developing the players to get them to a level, you know, to go into the under 18s and then progress, you know, through to the reserve grade. Chev Walker's been a great addition. He's doing a really good job, and he's now the transition coach, you know, from, you know, the under 18s into the first grade. And I think it's important that we keep building that and we keep strengthening that area. We're very good, on the strength and conditioning. We're very good on the medical side of things, but we've got to keep looking for those little pluses, that are going to make a difference.
And I know in terms of that sort of rugby player gene pool, not just rugby league, but also rugby union, you really cast the net wide and you go all over the country. I know you've been to venues down south and in the Midlands to look at some young rugby union players, and it's an option now to try and get those guys in and part of our programme.
I think rugby union, there's some amazing players in rugby union. They've got a huge talent pool. Not all those players will move through the grades, and play Premiership rugby, but there'll be certainly some, that could actually play a significant part in rugby league, in all positions. Our job is, to do our very best to try and identify them, and if we see a player, even if he's, an high performance, high standard player in rugby union, we've got to try and get that player. Leeds Rhinos is a youth club. We want the very best players, to come to Leeds Rhinos. We want to get back to where we were, the golden generation. I think we've got some players in our system now that can play a huge, huge part in us progressing, as a club and getting back to where we want to be as a club, winning trophies. But there's a process to that, and our philosophies have got to be centred around that.
Yeah, what probably some people aren't aware of, that rugby union's had some real challenges with its own youth development programmes. I mean, lost 3 of the professional teams in Wasps, Worcester and London Irish, and obviously the demise of Yorkshire Carnegie. And I know there is a Yorkshire RFU academy, but there's no professional club for them to directly feed into. So there's a lot of young talent around the country that actually hasn't got a path to professional rugby. So there's a great opportunity. Probably Ned McCormack's a great example from our side of things at the Rhinos, where Ned's come to us and made his Super League debut last year, just a couple of years after playing age group international rugby union.
His is a good example, is Ned. Obviously you went to Woodhouse Grove, local school, not too far away, from here. And he progressed, through their pathway, playing for, Yorkshire Academy, and then on, to play for England under 18s. And he was a player that, we identified and we wanted him to be part of us going forward. Whilst he's been unfortunate, with an hamstring injury, Ned's a huge talent, for the future at Leeds Rhinos. And he'll come back, and he has every opportunity to play in top grade, for many, many years at our club. But there's a lot of players in rugby union, that actually could transition and can transition, into rugby league. That maybe them options may be a little bit restricted and limited to in rugby union. In Yorkshire, I know most of the academy, coaches, with the Yorkshire Rugby Union, and they do a great job. Yeah, but it is difficult when you ain't got a Premiership rugby team in Yorkshire, and some of those players do it a cul-de-sac, which gives us a great opportunity, to be able to try and give them a chance at Leeds Rhinos, and that's working quite well, is that. And his brother Fergie McCormack's another player, that's got a really bright future. And again, getting players, from the community game of rugby union, West Park Bramhope, Harrogate Rugby Union, those players are starting now, to filter, into our scholarship. Our job is, to get them a greater understanding and be smarter, about understanding how rugby league's played, which can take a while. But there's no reason, why we can't challenge ourselves beyond Yorkshire as well. And Simon Bell and myself have done a fair bit of travelling, and watching rugby union. And there is some terrifically, talented lads, and we've got to try, and get some of those on board and help them, to be part of rugby league and help them to progress us as a club. And that's something that we're constantly working on. We have a guy called Abe Kerr who does a lot of work for us, down through the Midlands and in the South. And hopefully he's going to get us that player or players on board, that can again transition to rugby league and make it stronger, for our talent ID, not just specifically rugby league, but actually let's go broader. Let's look beyond that. Primarily, it's always going to be, the heartlands, in and around Yorkshire, the northwest counties, that's where Cumbria, that's where you're actually going to get the majority of your players from. But there's a bigger pool out there, and we have to be able to recognise that as well.
Yeah, and in terms of those players as well, people say about rugby league, it's a late development sport as well, and it's important that we don't just presumably just look at the younger end that we're constantly following. I know we have links with through Mark Buttrell up at Leeds Beckett University for student rugby league, and we have links with the college as well in Leeds City College as well in terms of developing players through that pathway. And presumably the more players we can be looking at, the greater chance we have of success.
That's always got to be our goal, Phil. Not just to be specific to one area. Let's broaden our horizons. And look, beyond, the heartlands to make sure that we get, quality players in. And again, the universities, it is important. Mark and the Leeds Beckett Uni guys, they're in the grand final next week. I think it's against Northumbria, down at Loughborough. And we look forward to going down there and watching that. And Leeds Beckett's a wonderful place, to be able to go and get some education and also, play rugby league, which allows, those players that actually want to play rugby league and challenge themselves at rugby league to be able to come onto our pathway as well. At the minute, it's reserve grade, and we can create opportunities for players that are good enough, or we think are at a standard where we can develop them in that area, which gives them, a pathway to say, right, I fancy having a real go at this. But certainly Leeds Beckett and the universities can be a significant part in that, and that includes Leeds University as well. But Leeds City College, that's been terrific, and over the years we have had some good players out of Leeds City College. And if they come into the Leeds Rhinos and they don't quite make it, with us, then they actually become part of the broader game. Many players have gone into the Championship, Phil, and done a great job, from college football and, from universities. And I think Mr. Walmsley at St. Helens, again, Bob had identified him, and we'll go back to Bob. He'd identified him, as a junior player. I think we watched him playing for Yorkshire against Lancashire at Youth. Did Bob and I, and it were like, you could see he had a talent. And further down the track, he ended up going to Leeds Beckett. Bob never took his eye off him. He was probably one that got missed for whatever reasons. But again, he's a wonderful example of, if you've got that drive, if you've got that desire to want to achieve things in rugby league, and it is an hard road, but the best of the best, they come through it. And I think by keeping going, by keeping challenging yourself, by staying humble and keeping your feet on ground, there's no reason, why you can't achieve things. Biggest thing for us or any club is always back youth development. Leeds have always done that. We're a huge club in regards to, wanting juniors to come through, and our senior players, they'll make a big difference, to that integration. And when you get that balance right, you'll find success. And the majority of teams that get success, they have that method.
That's a brilliant way of bringing it full circle there. Our youth development and going forward is a tribute and legacy to the hard work that Bob Pickles did here for many, many years. And also mentioning Alex Walmsley there, that, of course, the first team will take on Alex Walmsley and St Helens on Friday night in the Betfred Challenge Cup 4th round over at the Totally Wicked Stadium. So that rounds things up nicely for this episode of the Leeds Rhinos podcast. We'll be back to normal next week on the Thursday with our Q&A edition. So do send in your questions to info@therhinos.co.uk and we'll answer as many of them as we can. Don't forget to give us a review where you get your podcast to keep our ratings high and spread the good word about Leeds Rhinos and everything we're doing here at the club. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you receive your podcasts to make sure that we give you all the information as soon as it comes out and you can keep up to date on all our podcasts. We've just launched this week our latest new podcast series, the Leeds Rugby League Heritage Podcast. On the first episode, I'm joined by the head of our Heritage Committee, Phil Kaplan, and we talk about the birth of Headingley Stadium. Fascinating story, John, about how that all came about and how building a stadium here in Headingley actually gave the town of Leeds, because it was a town when it was first before it became a city, gave some civic pride and enabled the city to grow and eventually become a city, which will be celebrating here in Leeds in the next couple of years. A big milestone coming ahead for the city of Leeds on that one. So check that out. Great for you to join us. Make sure you're with us on Monday when we'll be reviewing the Betfred Challenge Cup 4th round tie at St Helens. Hopefully we're in the hat that night for the quarterfinals after a big win, and we're building up towards that massive game against Wigan Warriors here at AMT Headingley next Saturday. So join us on Monday to find out more about that. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, John. Great way for us to pay tribute to Bob Pickles. Very sadly missed by his many friends here at the club, and our thoughts go to his family at this sad time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on Monday.